Okay, well, good morning, everybody. Hope you people are doing really good. We have 7 or so minutes, and then we'll get our lecture underway. But for the time being, welcome back. And having a nice Friday so far. About 4 minutes. Good morning. So you got at least one more so far. Welcome back, everybody. Just a couple more minutes until we get to the class time. Good morning. Hey, Megan. Hey there, Senna. Good to see all you guys. Anybody just arriving, feel free to say hello. But yes, you guys are having a solid day so far. Hey, Eva. Hey, Kelly. Teaching? Just another minute, basically. Morning, Peachy. How's it going? Hey, Anthony. Okay, so hi, everybody. Welcome back. It's pretty much 9, so thanks for your attendance and all of your hard work through the semester. Today, what we're doing is we're going to take a second pass at this Peter Singer article, so there's a little more material there to go over, and we got through the first half pretty much last time, so now we just continue. I'm sure all you guys have heard this kind of extraordinary news about the president. Is that correct? I don't want to know. I hope I'm not the one to break it to anybody, but there was this coronavirus diagnosis that President Trump. Yeah, that's a big deal. That's crazy. So I'm sure that that's going to be the talk of the nation and the globe for at least a few days or weeks. Definitely a kind of bit unsettling when you have a leader of the free world dealing with something like that, but we have, I guess, established protocols, and we'll be all right in the end. It's just kind of like, wow, this virus just spares nobody, so it's definitely a good thing to maintain all the best practices to keep yourself healthy and safe. If it can make its way to the White House, then of course it's something that's hard to control. But anyway, guys, thanks for being here. Let's just jump right back into the lecture on Peter Singer. So this is the author. And as you guys know, his paper from 1993, Rich and Poor. Okay, so in the last meeting, I just was talking to you guys about the initial stuff in the paper. So just to recap again, he begins by just talking to us about the condition of absolute poverty. That is defined as not having enough income or wealth to meet the basic human needs of food, clothing, and shelter. And there's a lot of people on the planet Earth living that way, over 1 billion, according to even conservative estimates. So if you're living in that way, it's very hard to survive. You might starve. You might be in a part of the world where there's poor public sanitation, public health, a lot of other opportunistic diseases and infections. And so it's a degraded set of conditions, and it produces misery, death, and premature death and a short life. So on the other hand, there's people that are like us living in the first world industrialized nations that fall into the category of the absolutely affluent, meaning having more than enough income and wealth to meet the same basic human needs of food, clothing, and shelter. So he poses the question, why don't we feel a moral obligation to divert some of our surplus wealth, which we have beyond necessity, to the cause of global poverty? And if we did that, then we can make an improvement on the situation without even undermining our own well-being in any significant way. He knows that some people argue that this is a problem of scarcity, therefore it cannot be reasonably solved because there's just never going to be enough food basically for everybody who needs it. But he doesn't agree with that analysis. He mentioned, as I was telling you guys, that it's not a problem of scarcity of resources, but waste and inefficient use or poor distribution of the available resources. For one, we waste a lot of consumable resources, and then also we divert a lot of them to animals that we bring up for market production as meat. And so that actually results in a lot of inefficient waste of available consumable resources that could more effectively be given directly to human beings and feed the global population. So what's the next thing to say? He points out the rates of donation from wealthy to poor nations, and he pointed out that there's that at least the United States and some other major countries have fallen short of a modest target of 0.7% of gross domestic product. So now we've reached the part in his paper where he poses this kind of very tough question, and it's just, given theoretically. But what he says is this: if killing somebody is obviously one of the worst things you could do, what's the big real difference between the act of killing and a failure to render assistance when said assistance would have otherwise saved the lives? So if you withhold on assistance and the result of the withholding of assistance is that people die or starve or whatever, is this different from killing? So is there any moral equivalence or any comparison at all between killing and the failure to assist? Now, having put it out there, Peter Singer himself quickly says this: that's probably a bit too far, and I'm sure you can understand why he would sort of want to moderate that comment, or at least modify it in some way, because he says, obviously you and I probably would resist any moral comparison between us who may fail to give charity money and those who kill. So like, how can the moral characteristic of an actual killer be in any way compared to those who fail to assist the poor? He knows there's probably a difference between killing and failing to assist, but the thing is this: he still wants to show that even if killing is worse, that doesn't excuse all the blame of the failure to assist. So the next little section of his paper is where he actually goes over what he calls differences between killing and failing to assist. The reason he's talking about these differences is because he wants to demonstrate to the reader that he's aware of the points that someone might make in rejecting the comparison. So what could be claimed as the differences between killing and failing to assist, and after he states what they are, he'll go back through them one time and just try to show the reader that although they may show that killing is worse than failing to assist, morally speaking, it's not necessarily that that removes all the blame morally from failure to assist. It's still in some significant way wrong, even if we could concede that killing is worse. So let's go over that. Here he's going to provide a little 5-point list of differences between killing and failing to assist. Okay, so one of the differences that he mentioned was difference of motivation, different motivation. All right, so to explain the point here, he refers often in this part of the paper to the case of the killer that's the shooter. So like, examples where someone has taken a weapon and killed people in a public place. So consider such an example. What's the motive of that person that's doing that? It's pretty clear, and it's very evil. The person's motive is to cause people to die, right? To be the reason they die, not to let them die of natural causes, but to be the agent of their death. And so the killer, the shooter, whoever it is, they have a very wicked and evil motive, one that intends death, one that seeks to harm and destroy life. But let's compare that to the case of any of us who, let's say, maybe just fail to assist or give money to the poor. If you or I withhold on aid and instead just, spend it on ourselves for something like, a nice meal or some new clothes or some technological device or a concert, travel, whatever it is, if we spend some money on ourselves instead of giving it to the poor, what's the motive there? Is it the motive that you're trying to harm people? Is it the same motive the killer has? It's not the same, right? What would you call that motive? The motive of the person who, instead of providing aid, just, spend money on stuff that they want for themselves. What would be the motivation? Is it a motivation seeking harm? Is it a motivation in pursuit of anyone's death. No, it's just to, you say help yourself or make yourself happy. Yeah, it's just for your own self-interest. It's for your own satisfaction. So you do it to promote your own happiness, right? It does not enter the mind of the person who fails to assist that they are doing something that denies funding to poor people who could starve. There's no person out there that I've ever heard of who buys a nice item or meal and sits there thinking, wow, the pleasure I'm getting out of it is really mostly the psychological idea that this money otherwise could have gone to poor people, which now maybe die. And so sticking it to the poor again as I eat this meal is really what I enjoy. Nobody's thinking that thought, or at least if they are, that's extremely rare. Most anybody just derives a pleasure from it, and it never enters their mind what more noble or beneficent things the money could have otherwise been spent on. So one thing that's different is the motive is different. And there you could say that shows killing is worse. It's based on a much worse motive than the failure to assist. Now here's another difference. There's also the point that it's not hard to avoid killing, but it's actually very hard to save all the lives that you could possibly save by means of assistance. So here we say, not hard to avoid killing, but very hard, on the other hand, to save all the lives that you can. Okay, so here's yet another way to think of the difference between the two cases of killing and failing to assist. One could reasonably argue that they cannot be compared or in any way equated, because the obligation of not killing people, which is what we're told is on the one hand, is a very easy obligation to live up to. On the other hand, this compared obligation of do provide aid or assistance, that doesn't require inaction. That's not easy. That requires action, effort, time, dedication, perhaps sustained over a long period. So you can argue that the two obligations are not on a par, because one is a simple thing and it's easy to do, and the other one is not at all. So when one fails to assist, they're failing to live up to a much bigger obligation than the person who just doesn't kill people. Sorry there, boy. So yeah, that's Eddie. So like, okay, let's just help you understand this with one little discussion to follow. I will assume something about everyone in this meeting that I think is probably a given, but you can never guarantee. Anyway, it's just a little dark humor. But I think that probably none of you have ever killed another person. And so if that's fair to say, then you can relate. If you've not killed a person, then tell me, do you think it's been hard so far to not kill people? I would hope not. What do you have to do to not kill people? What does that take? What kind of energy or effort does that take? It takes nothing. To not kill people, what do you have to do? You just have to basically mind your own business and leave people alone, which is literally doing nothing. How many people are you not killing right now? All of them, billions of them, every single one. So not killing people is just a matter of minding your own business and leaving people alone. It requires that you do nothing. It requires that you fail to do certain things, like harm people. But what about assistance to the poor? Through charity, through donation, through volunteer work. Is that just leaving people alone and minding your own business? No. That's doing things, not failing to act. That's going out and giving money, time, aid, or whatever, and maybe doing it for a long time. So you could say that the two things, again, are way different and they can't be compared, because in the case of killing, I'm told I have an obligation which is super easy to live up to. Done. Okay, and I'm not doing that, and that's easy. But on the other hand, if we compare that to failure to assist, it's not such an easy burden to meet that moral obligation. Okay. Now, third, there is difference of certainty in the outcome. Okay, so what's mentioned in this point is that if you consider that case of a person that's a killer or that intends to kill, you know, like a shooter or something, how sad is it to know that if they really, really want to do that, the access that people have to these high-powered weapons is such easy things to get that there's very, very good percentage chance that if a person with that intent and with those means wants to go out and hurt people or kill them, that they're very likely going to. Because as you guys know, right, I mean, the killer, the shooter, whoever it is, they usually plot these things in advance, and then they have the element of surprise. So by the time they start firing off shots in a place, everyone's already at a loss, and they're not prepared for what's happening. So the point then is that when one seeks to kill using whatever those weapons are, it's highly certain that that's actually going to result in death. But take the case of the failure to assist. You could argue that the failure to assist is not as certain as that it's going to cause harm or death to anybody, because you can make the case that even if I would have given the money, it might have been wasted by the aid agency on overhead costs, on projects that perhaps were wasteful or not effective. Maybe like a well was built in like a village somewhere, but the village has recently been deserted as like a refugee zone, and so it's not really being helpful to anybody. So you can always wonder, should I give this money to the donation agency? If I do, it might save lives. Or maybe they will just squander it and mismanage the money. So the connection between the failure to assist and the likelihood of a person's harm is weaker than in the case of a person with the intent to kill. So that's another difference of certainty of the outcome. How certain is it that somebody's going to actually die if someone sets forth to kill? Sad to say, it's pretty certain. But how certain is it that anyone will die or whatever if you just don't give money? There's a little more ambiguity and room for doubt that that's going to result in harm. I always think when I teach this lecture on this point, well, now that we're all at home and we don't go to school in a campus, or at least for the time being, we don't have this public school kind of shooter thing to worry about. But yeah, whenever I teach this, I always think about that, how such a person has got a high likelihood to whatever, succeed in their mission to kill people. It's almost like it makes me think that sometimes we're living at the mercy of these psychopathic people. Like, are they going to let me live today? I mean, it's kind of their choice. You know, it's not much I can do about it if the person really, really wanted to. But anyways, I digress. So there's another difference of certainty of the outcome. And then the fourth one he mentions was identifiability of the victim. Identifiability of the victim. Okay, so taking these two cases again, killing, failing to assist. If a person kills people, then literally they have victims that are their victims, and it's clear that it's their direct responsibility for these people having died. And when a person kills, you know, they produce identifiable victims who have names, identities, specific people that we can clearly connect to the killer's actions. But when you fail to assist, right, or me, or whoever, if one of us walks right past the charity donation bucket and don't give anything, you can always say that, first of all, if there's anybody in the world that dies of starvation like around that time period, subsequent to you choosing not to aid, there's no way that we can connect those two events though, right? We can't say, hey, here's one specific person somewhere in the third world who starved, and we trace that back to your individual decision to not have given any aid. See, it doesn't work like that. There's no clear line of responsibility that starts from you failing to assist to a particular nameable individual somewhere in the third world dying. So that's another main difference. When one kills, it's clear who the identities of their victims are, and it's their personal responsibility for having caused that. When you fail to assist, though, even if you think somehow, somewhere in the world, a person on that day or nearby to that time didn't meet their nutritional needs and ended up dying, there's no way that we can link it precisely to one person's inaction. Action to kill produces a victim, but inaction to assist, it's not in any way possible to draw a direct line between the two things. Okay, and then there's one more difference. I guess I'll put it up here because I've run out of a little room on the board there, so here's some space. Sorry. Yeah, so one more difference that he mentions is this one, that you can always say it's not my fault that they're poor. But you can never say anything like that, obviously, in the case of killing. So. You can always say it's not my fault that they're poor. Okay, so about that, Trying to get that glare to like not really bother you too much. We do our best. That's how it's going to be for now. Okay, so you can always say it's not my fault that they are poor. I want you to take another little trip down a thought experiment. Okay, a hypothetical scenario. This one's not too weird, but it's a little trippy. So okay, think about this world that we're in, right? But I want you to imagine a situation where this world and everything in it is still there, but you just were never born. Basically, I'm asking you, imagine the world as it would have been if your parents never met and you were never born. Okay, everything else is the same. This lecture's still happening, except you're one person who's not there because you don't exist. Okay, you never started to exist. So suppose that was the case. Obviously, it's not. I'm glad that you were born. But if you had not been, what do you think? Would there still have been all the poor people of the third world? Would there still be the problem of global hunger and poverty if you had not been born? Would that still have existed or not? What do you think? I mean, it's an obvious kind of almost rhetorical question, but just let me know what you think. Clearly, yes, Megan. Yeah. It's not at all the case, and you know, obviously, that your birth did not usher in the existence of these global problems. It's not like contingent on your birth is the case of the poor. The situation has already been there. You were born into a world where those problems existed. So what does it mean that it still would have been there even if you had not been born? Well, one thing it means is that your existence itself, the fact that you exist, neither contributes nor diminishes from the existence of the problem. So a person could argue that I'm not responsible then to fix a problem which was already there when I was born. It's not that I caused that problem. Now, if you kill people, of course, that's your problem. You've caused the harm, and you have to face accountability, and it's your personal responsibility to be held accountable. But in the case of the failure to assist, you can say, well, here's a situation where I'm not doing anything to rectify an existing problem, but I'm not the cause of it. So it's not like I'm deficient in a moral responsibility. I would be if I didn't take accountability for a problem or harm that I caused. But here we have a global problem of poverty that is not sensitive to the fact even that I exist. So why should I feel burdened by an obligation to correct a problem that I didn't cause? Okay, so those are differences between killing and failing to assist. But then Peter Singer, having presented them, wants to just try and mention to the reader why he thinks that nonetheless, although many of these show that killing is worse, they don't excuse all the blame from the failure to assist, and it still remains to some significant degree a bad thing. So let me kind of walk you through how he goes over these points next to show that there's still something wrong with failing to assist. First of all, about the identifiable victim. Okay, what he basically says is that if you engage in behavior that exposes people to added risk, then even if we don't know whom has been harmed through your risky behavior precisely, we can still say that it was bad. Okay, now he gave a weird example to make this point. I can think of one that's maybe a little more relatable to our current situation. So suppose that somebody wants to like go into a crowded area but not wear a mask right now during this pandemic. And just because that's their preference, they don't like to wear masks, they find them uncomfortable or something like that. So that person goes out and definitely will place some people at risk, suppose, in that case, right? Now, suppose that this one individual who's gone around not wearing a mask in a crowded places, afterwards, some people have become sick with the virus, right? Now, is there any exact way that we're going to be able to say, hey, this one sick person got it because you didn't wear a mask? I mean, we know that there's contact tracing and all that, but honestly, it's kind of a mess because there's just so many sick people and the virus is so widespread that it's kind of hard to make precise determinations of the ancestry of where you got it from. Now, does that mean that since we can't tell exactly who got sick because of the one person's maskless behavior, that means he's done nothing wrong? No, it's still definitely wrong. Now, if somebody goes out and kills people, it's obvious that we can draw a direct line of responsibility between some harmed individual and the killer's decision-making and behavior. But when you take risky behavior, where we don't know exactly where the risk has been realized, it still was to some degree wrong just because it added to that risk and exposed people to more risk. So in comparison, right, when one fails to assist the poor, there's no exact way to say who's been a person who starved due to the one actor's failure to donate. But since it established greater probability of harm out there in some manner, it's nonetheless wrong to some degree. Singer's own example about that point wasn't about masks, obviously. It's 1993 when he wrote it. So he gave very weird hypothetical where like a person sells a product and the product will double the consumer's risk of getting stomach cancer. And then suppose years pass and one of the consumers got stomach cancer, goes back to the vendor and says, it's your fault, you're responsible. The vendor may seek to evade responsibility by saying, well, can you really prove it though? Because my product doesn't guarantee the onset of stomach cancer. It just doubles the probability by twice. So maybe it's the case that you got it from me, or maybe the fact that you took my product was a false positive indicator and really you got it from environmental exposure of another kind or from your own genetic predisposition. You know, so like he may try and say, I don't know if it's specifically your ailment is coming from using my product, but didn't he sell a product that knowingly added risk to the equation? Therefore, it's still wrong, even if we cannot, with absolute precision, point out every single victim of the act, okay, or the inaction in some case. So that's his response to identifiability of the victim. Difference of certainty of the outcome. Okay, now with that one, example given to make the point that's really useful is the drunk driver versus a homicidal driver. Okay, now take a case of a drunk driver. A drunk driver getting behind the wheel is a bad thing. That person obviously, you know, could cause injury, death, or whatever to other people or to themselves. So when they do it, they're definitely taking risks, not just with their own life, but with other people's life and safety too. But take another case, a homicidal driver. I'm talking to you about a person who's getting behind the wheel, not drunk, but getting behind the wheel full of homicidal rage, and their goal is to ram the car into as many people in a public area as possible and try to kill a bunch of them. Has that ever happened? Yes, tragically it has. Terrorist attacks in France, and it's also happened in Germany and here in Los Angeles, the Santa Monica Farmers Market and at the 3rd Street Promenade, and then also Venice Beach Boardwalk. So there's been a couple of vehicular homicide incidents. Now let's compare the two again. Remember, drunk driver, homicidal driver. Which of the two examples is likelier to produce death and injury? Neither one's good or safe, obviously. But if you had to pick, which of the two do you think would be even likelier to cause some real serious death or injury? The homicidal driver or the drunk one? The homicidal driver, sure, Megan, yeah. And why? Well, hopefully it's clear. It's because that person's intending to do it. So if they hit the people, it won't be inadvertent, it won't be an accident. It'll be what they're trying to do, and so they'll deploy like skill and intent in doing that. Now, the drunk driver, could they hit people? Yes, very well. It's just not as likely because it's not the event that they're hoping to happen. Of course, they want to not be detected as having been drunk. They don't want to get into legal trouble or anything. So they may hit people, but it wouldn't be on purpose. So look, again, the certainty of the the outcome in the two cases is different. It's a lot more certain where we consider the homicidal driver that someone will be harmed than in the case of the drunk driver. But does that excuse our drunk driver? Does that mean, hey, drunk driver, it's all good and there's no problem because there's other things people do with the car that are even likelier to hurt people? No way, it's still wrong. Just because, as before, it increases the risk to certain unknown individuals of harm. So by comparison, when you fail to assist, is it quite as certain as intending on killing to hurt people? No, it's not. But nonetheless, it could still be blameworthy on some level just because, as again, it increases the risk to certain people of not meeting their nutritional needs and therefore dying of starvation. So the next point, you can talk about this one. You can always say it's not my fault that they are poor. He has a kind of two-part reply to that. Okay, so first of all, he takes this line of attack. He says, to the claim that it's not my or our fault that they're poor, you can argue that that's debatable. Is it not our fault? Well, perhaps in a sense, because we are living today, and a lot of the problems that we're referring to are traced back to earlier historical periods where there were economic inequities and so forth. So you can argue that I didn't cause all those problems. But some people think, and it's been argued by some scholars, that the disparities that we see in wealth and development in the world have to do in part with the system of colonial economic exploitation that preceded us, right? So some say that the colonial system of economic exploitation produced these disparities where we have haves and have-nots globally. And you can argue then that if we continue to be the benefactors of somehow an unjust system of economic exploitation, then do we have an obligation to redress some of the wrongs because we continue to be the beneficiaries of ill-gotten gains? That's what some people argue. And then you might argue that we have at least an indirect moral responsibility to try and restore some equity. But, okay, having put that point on the table, he says a lot of people would not agree with it. And I'm sure you can understand why it's not necessarily the most popular argument, because a lot of folks will say that that's just wrong. You can't impose the sins of the father on the son, as it says in the Bible. Don't burden people living now with historical injustices that existed before any of us were alive. So, okay, he says, I have a second line of argument for you then. If you don't believe that we bear even minimal indirect responsibility for these inequalities, then he has another reason to still think that you have an obligation, which is that he's a utilitarian. And as a utilitarian, your obligation at all times is just do whatever it takes to create the most overall happiness for the greatest number of people. It doesn't say maximize utility, but only when you've caused a problem to start off with. It's just a standing obligation regardless of the situation. So like if you're a utilitarian and you're walking past a burning building, which you could easily prop the door open to release people inside that are trapped, the utilitarian could not justify continuing to just walk past by saying, well, look, I didn't set the fire. I'm not the arsonist. These people are on fire in their house, but that's their problem. A utilitarian couldn't do that, even though they didn't cause the fire. They're just in a position where they can either prevent more harm or not. And as a utilitarian, it doesn't really matter what the genesis of the harmed or non-optimal situation is. It's just a question whether you are in a position to improve on it. And if you are, then you should. So he has those two things to say about this point. Maybe we bear some indirect responsibility to some extent if we benefit from those systems, if that argument is fair. Or if you don't agree with that, then anyway, just be a utilitarian. Okay, and then so last, well, there's two more. There's different motivation. With the different motivation argument, we can refer again to the whole homicidal driver versus drunk driver example. The motivation of the homicidal driver is clear and it's very evil. It's to hurt people, it's to cause their lives to end. But the motivation of the drunk driver is not to really hurt anybody. As bad as what they're doing is, their motive is just to get home under their own power without staying at someone's house or calling a ride or getting a ride service. So the motives are not as bad. You know, the motive of the drunk driver is not as evil and wicked as the motive of the homicidal person. But nonetheless, does that remove the blame from the person? It doesn't. It's still to some extent wrong what this drunk driver is doing, merely on the basis that it knowingly adds risk to the world. And so one who fails to assist might not be motivated by anyone starving or dying. Of course they're not, and we've talked about that. But if you think that that adds risk to some people that may otherwise have survived with money or food, then maybe it's still reckless in some way. And then finally, that's not hard to avoid killing, but it's really hard to save everybody's life that you could. He says that in a way that kind of misunderstands the obligation that he's arguing that we have, because he's not really arguing that we should drop everything and give all our money and time in a never-ending struggle to save as many lives as possible, which would obviously be overwhelming and too much to expect. Instead, he says that he's merely arguing that we should do more than just nothing at all when it comes to helping the poor. And viewed from that perspective, just do something instead of nothing, maybe the obligation no longer appears to be so hugely burdensome that it cannot be reasonably expected for people to try and make some effort towards it. So, okay, look, what I've just talked to you about so far as we continue working through the Singer article is this. He brought us to a point after setting up the initial discussion where he posed the question, is there anything to be compared between killing and failing to assist? He kind of walked it back and he said, well, maybe it's not as bad, but what are the differences? We've listed those differences, and the differences seek to make the point that there's a major difference between killing and failing to assist, so don't compare them. Now, what Singer has said after analyzing the points here is that many of them do in fact demonstrate that killing is by comparison worse than the failure to assist. But for the reasons that we've gone over just now, they don't excuse or remove all blameworthiness from the failure to assist. It's still wrong on some level, even if it's not perhaps on a par with trying to kill people. So that brings us to the next part of the discussion, and this is a big part of his article. He finally thinks that he's ready to state affirmatively his obligation to assist argument. So I kind of think of the paper almost as separated into two parts. There's going on defense, and then this is now kind of going on offense. So he's defended against possible criticisms. Now he wants to show to the reader what the argument really is in favor of giving money to the poor. So he gives this argument, which is stated as a kind of formal argument with I think 3 premises that lead to the conclusion. You'd find it in the book on page 144. So that's what I'm opening it to. Yeah, so there's 3 premises of this argument. I use black. So let's call this the obligation to assist argument, OTA. This is all from Peter Singer. Okay, first premise of the argument is this. It's an if-then claim. So it says, if we can prevent something bad without sacrificing anything of comparable significance, then we ought to. Then, in that case, we should prevent that bad thing. Okay, if we can prevent something bad without sacrificing anything of comparable significance, then we should. Let me make that word a little more legible. Then we should. Okay, now the second premise just says something very straightforward, which is that absolute poverty is bad. The third premise says that we can prevent some absolute poverty without sacrificing anything of comparable significance. So we've gotten to the conclusion. When you reach the conclusion of a logical argument, there's often this convention where there's a horizontal line and the conclusion goes below. Who can deduce the conclusion of this argument? It's pretty elementary. Starts with an if-then, and then it just continues to kind of affirm the antecedent of the if-then. So it says, if we can prevent something bad without sacrificing anything of comparable moral significance, then in that case we should. Next, well, absolute poverty is bad. Furthermore, we can prevent some absolute poverty without sacrificing anything of comparable significance. So therefore, what follows is that we ought to. Yes. Well, Eva, let me see. You refer here to the first premise. Isn't that just what it says? If we can prevent some absolute poverty without sacrificing anything of comparable significance, then we ought to. But that's the first premise. The conclusion is different from the premise. The conclusion is, well, Megan, you say, if we can assist the poor population of the world, then we should do what we can to help. Okay, fair enough, yes, but those are summary statements of the first premise. The conclusion is a little just more simple. It's a part of that first premise, but it's not the whole thing. It doesn't include the word if and then, the conclusion. It's just a categorical statement. So what do you think that definitive conclusion would be? It starts with if then. It says if this, then that. If we can prevent some stuff like that without making major sacrifices, we should, and it's bad and we can, and so therefore, it's not too difficult. What do you think? Not that we can, it's that we should. Eva, there's a descriptive and normative difference. Can is just what, can refers to what one is able to do, but should refers to what one ought to do. So yeah, that we ought to or whatever. So we should prevent some absolute poverty. I'll just abbreviate with AP for absolute poverty. Now, that's the argument. And let me just try and go over the premises one time to make it clear enough. Yeah, good, no problem, Eva and others. So about premise one, that's really the main premise that's doing a lot of the work. What it says is that if you have an opportunity to prevent something bad without even making major sacrifices, or at least without making sacrifices that compare to the level of what you're trying to prevent, then you should go ahead and prevent the bad thing. Okay, so to illustrate this premise, there's a hypothetical that Peter Singer's kind of famous for using, and maybe at some point I'll even link you guys to a video in the announcements and stuff, because there's a cool talk that he gave at Princeton 7 or 8 years ago where he gives discussion of the example, but then you can see him speak, kind of see what he's all about. But anyways, he gives this scenario. It's a hypothetical, but I'll come back to the question of does it necessarily need to be a hypothetical, but suppose it's a hypothetical where there's a drowning child, okay? So you're walking along, just taking a walk, and in some like little area where you see that there's a pond, let's imagine that there's a kid, a small kid that's in there, and that they're struggling to stay above the water. I guess apparently they were playing in the water, but then they got too far in, and now they're crying out for help because they're afraid of drowning in the water. Now, suppose that you're uniquely positioned to help, that there's no other people around right now at that particular place, and they see you, and they're like, help me, help me. I'm just a little boy or girl. I just want to live. Help pull me out of the water. Now, suppose that what you've got to do to get them out of the water, if you choose to do it, is just walk over there and lean your arm down and just pull them up. It'll just take a moment. It might be a slight little bit of physical exertion, but it's not too bad. So let's plug that into this example here. In that scenario, what's the bad thing that you could prevent? That's, I think, straightforward. The negative bad thing that the scenario says that the subject could prevent is obviously the what? The drowning of the child. That's a bad thing. Okay? And what is the sacrifice, if any, that the passerby would have to make to get to this saving of the child? Is there a sacrifice? If there is, just tell me. It's very minimal, if anything. What do they have to give up to help this kid? Their clothes maybe get a little wet, maybe a little late for work, sure, okay? But so should he or she save the child? Well, according to the argument given here, yes. And he thinks that that'll seem quite intuitive to your own moral common sense. Because when it's a child dying, and all you got to sacrifice is maybe like a moment of time and some physical exertion, then you should do that, because although the lost time and whatever dirty clothes is not nice, that does not compare in significance or importance to the life of somebody. So you should try to basically, what this says is prevent bad things as long as you can do it without making a sacrifice that is equal to the bad thing itself, because then it would just cancel out. He gives a second version of it where the sacrifice is a little more substantial. Suppose that the kid is a little deeper in the water and the water's quite muddy. So for you to really get to the kid, it's not just a simple act of leaning over where maybe your shoes will just get a little wet. Suppose you've got your nicest outfit on. You're dressed to the nines, and you've got this great fit, very expensive, all designer, but there's a drowning kid, and the only way you're going to get to him is to wade into the water a little bit. There's no risk to your life, but you're going to ruin these nice clothes. Maybe it costs $1,000 or more, the fit that you're wearing, right? So clothes got to go in the trash. Do you think you still have the obligation there? And just I'll help you out. Singer says you agree that yes, because although that's a little more of a sacrifice than just leaning over for a minute, the sacrifice of the expensive clothes still pales in comparison to the importance of a human life. So in what situation, according to the argument given, would you be not burdened with an obligation to save the child's life? You should save their life, but you're not really obligated to do it if it would require what from you? According to the logic of the argument, what type of sacrifice would you not necessarily have to make to save the kid's life? If it would risk your own life, okay, good, because then what you sacrifice and what you prevent are canceling each other out, and there's no real improvement in the overall situation. So this says, as long as you can prevent a bad thing without the sacrifice being equal to the bad thing, then you should. Okay, so like if you got close to the kid and he says, "Get me out of here," but then you see shark fins circling all around and there's like snipers on towers above with like little red beams, then you might say, "I'm sorry, youngster, but I'd really love to help you. It's just that it seems like I'm going to die if I do that. And, you know, my life or your life is just going to cancel out the importance." If you see someone with their arm under a heavy object and like, "Get my arm out of here," it'd be great if you could put like a rod or something in there so they could slide it out. But it would make no sense if you said, "Okay, I'm going to count to 3. You can slide your arm out. I'm going to put mine in there. Then you'll be out of here." You know, in that case, it's just one person's arm is out, but now another one's is in. So that didn't really change much. So, okay, in the bigger picture now, with the real argument that we're looking at, the claim that Singer is making is this: we are members of the first world and we have wealth in abundance. And since we have this abundant wealth beyond our basic needs, we should be willing to take some of that extra and give it off to the poor to alleviate or remedy at least some of the global hunger. If we did, he says, the sacrifice of the wealth that we would give up would not be at all equal or comparable to the death that we're preventing by means of it. What things might we have to give up or sacrifice? Well, he says the things that, you know, like, here's a list. Just how much we would think we need to give up will depend on what we think is of comparable significance to the poverty we could prevent. But stylish clothes, expensive dinner, sophisticated stereo system, overseas holidays, second car, larger house, private schools, none of these is likely to be of comparable significance to the reduction of absolute poverty. And so there you have it. He's saying that we have an obligation essentially because we can prevent a lot of death in the third world by means of aid at low cost to ourselves, with not much sacrifice even to our own material well-being or self-interest. So why not do that? Because the failure to do it is failing to act on an obligation that we can act on, and the sacrifices are not that significant compared to the reduction of death from those acts. Now, there's still a little more in the paper because he goes over what are objections to his argument. So, you know, you might be a person who's not necessarily a fan of some of the things he's arguing, which is totally fine. And if that's so, then some of these objections may appeal to you. Singer is so thorough that he really does try to give voice to his critics. And so he gives the arguments of the critic and presents the objections in his own paper so that he can reply to them. So the last thing I want to just cover as we wrap this article up, and the Garrett Hardin article that follows this, that says we don't have obligation to the poor, it's much more, I think, straightforward, and so that we can easily get in on our Monday meeting. But let me just add a little discussion of these objections to his obligation to assist argument. Okay, so he's got a set of objections that he thinks are the most powerful ones that could be raised against that argument that we just saw here on the board. And so what, you know, philosophical rational arguments could be marshaled against what he has said. He gives labels to them so that they'll be easier to remember. One he calls taking care of our own. Now keep in mind, he's not the critic of his own argument. He's just presenting these so that you understand what critics do say against the argument. And he's also interested in trying to rebut these objections after he presents them. So that's why he does present it. It's like, you know, if you're a lawyer, you have to think about what the opposing attorney on the other side of the case might say so that you're ready to reply in the courtroom, right? So if you think that the defense is going to present a certain type of argument, you have to be aware of what the argument is and maybe even notify it to the jury. Here's the argument they're making, and here's why it's actually not so good. So Peter Singer's doing this. He's presenting the argument given against his view by his critics so that he can eventually try and rebut. Taking care of our own is one of the objections. Now, there's not much time left, so I'm just going to quickly refer to some points in the argument, and then we'll continue as we have done before on Monday. But based on the name, it's kind of a dead giveaway what this objection is going to say. So suppose that someone has this objection to the argument we saw. What do you think they're saying? That I do not have a moral obligation to assist the global poor of the third world internationally. If I have obligations to take care of or to help anyone, it's not the global poor. It's just who, you think, according to the objection? Well, as it says there, our own. And who are our own? Well, most immediately, it's your own family and friends. But perhaps if you want to expand the circle of concern a little further, you could say our fellow citizens and maybe the poor within our own borders and within our own country. But some might argue, reasonably or not, that we don't necessarily have an obligation that extends further than that we cannot be seen as responsible for the needs of all of those in the world who are starving, but merely our own. And therefore, one might reject the argument on those grounds by saying that it affirms an obligation to the general human population, but my obligations are more limited than that. They only extend as far as my own, in some sense, to be explained of what my own means. Another objection is the property rights objection. So you can argue that the problem with Singer's argument is that it's not respectful of property rights. It seems to say that I have a moral obligation to give over some of my wealth, which is part of my property, to a cause of helping the poor. But the argument can be replied to by saying I have property rights, and my property rights entitle me to do as I see fit with my wealth and my property. I'm free to do as I see fit with it, spend it on whatever I want or not spend it on whatever I want, or even to spend it on wasteful and frivolous things. If I wanted tomorrow, and to buy to buy a watch, I have several watches, so it's kind of funny, me, as much as I'm sure most all of us are in some ways subject to some of the critiques that he's making, right? Because why would I have bought another one just for an additional outfit if I could have done something with it? I've already gotten multiple timepieces. But suppose that I want to buy like a really expensive Rolex watch for $10,000. Do I have the right to do that? Sure, I do, because my money is my property, and I have the right to expend it on things that I want, things that I need, things that are frivolous, or whatever else. So to say that I have an obligation to give some of that to the poor would be like saying that I'm not at liberty to do what I see fit with my property, but I am. So there's another objection. There's more to say. I guess we have, let's see, two more objections. The triage objection, which is, I think, fascinating because it has some connection to our pandemic world that we're living in. And then the final one is, let's see, leaving it to the government. Just one word, like 2 seconds, because that one's so easy to say. Leaving it to the government. So some are going to say that I don't have an obligation and individual citizens don't have an obligation, but if any one or thing does, it's the government at large, the society itself. So if someone or something has an obligation to assist the poor, let it not be private charitable donations, but government aid provided on the basis of a government plan that we all pay into as taxpayers. That's another alternative objection that tries to take the responsibility and elevate it to the level of society rather than the individual, which is another interesting objection. But there's one more objection to go over, and then we have maybe 10 minutes or so at the beginning on Monday to conclude this whole topic and this talk. So have a great weekend, guys. I don't want to keep you beyond our allotted time. But thanks again for your attendance today, and I'll be grading those papers, and we'll be in touch if you need anything over the weekend, okay? So have a great weekend, and stay safe, and I'll see you guys next time. Thanks.